to like, I'm not at home, right? But I had like a whole light that just, it's still going.
This is like the brightest it gets in my living room.
It says that it's streaming, but.
Yeah, it says, I mean, I see that it says
Okay,
live on custom live streaming service.
Awesome, good. So it's working. Awesome. So we can start like whenever you want. Good?
Yeah.
Right, cool. So let me get my little theme song up here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this week on the IDRA Hour, we are really particularly honored and excited to be joined by Ariel Angel, the editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents, who is with us obviously right now. Before we start talking, let's just play a little bit of our snazzy theme song. That's not it. Let's do it right here. Thank you, as always, to Alon Eder for the rights to that wonderful piece. So welcome, Ariel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
At the outset, I just want to say like how appreciative I am that you're joining me. You don't know me. You're, I think, the first guest that I have no outside relationship with at all. And so it's cool of you to say yes to speaking with me about this. And like already it's clear that we disagree on a number of things. And so it's just wonderful to have a conversation with someone, you know, who we know we disagree, we don't see eye to eye, and yet we're really open to this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, also we agree on a lot of things too.
We also agree on a lot of things, which we'll get to both. I hope we'll have time for both. Definitely we do. In fact, we really agree on a lot of things. So that's really exciting as well. So for the sake of anyone who doesn't know you, let's just talk a little bit about your background. You know, who are you? Where do you come from? Where did you grow up?
Okay. I am originally from Miami, Florida, North Miami Beach, which is a very kind of heavily Jewish area of Miami. I grew up, I went to day school until 8th grade, and then I went to public school. My family went to a conservative Ashkenazi synagogue, even though I'm actually Sephardi and Mizrahi. My dad's family, my dad's parents are Holocaust survivors from Salonika, Ladino speakers who emigrated in the 50s to Brooklyn and had kind of a small Greek and Italian specialty store. And my mom's parents, my grandfather's background is Algerian from Algeria to Palestine to Ohio, where I met my grandmother, and they came to Miami in the 50s for his surgical residency. So my mom's kind of a native of Miami. It's very rare. It's a kind of conservative community. I grew up in the conservative movement, but the Jewish community there is sort of one of the most conservative federations, for example, in the country, politically conservative. And so I grew up in a very heavily Zionist background. I went to a URJ summer camp, Crane Lake. I kind of did the whole life cycle there, and also, you know, spent summers in Israel. I did like a kind of Israeli Peace Corps, Tevel B'Tzedek in Nepal. So I kind of was always pretty involved in Jewish communal life until I got to college, at which point it's sort of, I didn't have a community really. And I pretty much was out of Jewish communal life until 2014, even though I had been sort of doing different things in the Jewish world, but they weren't really communal activities. So I had like a ketubah company because I was an artist. People started asking me to make ketubot. And I had been working on a novel that had very heavily Jewish themes. But I really I wasn't doing anything in any kind of community until 2014, at which point the Gaza war happened, the assault on Gaza. And I kind of saw a lot of my upbringing around Zionism start to crop up in uncomfortable ways. I started to sort of feel like that the story that I was raised with wasn't really resonating with me in the same way. And that in fact, I didn't really know a lot about what was going on in Israel, even though I felt really close to it. It was really at first just a hunch that things like weren't right. I had been talking to my mom a lot about the kind of what seemed to me to be a disproportionate use of force. And my mom was sort of kind of, there was a lot of like screaming fights where she was saying a lot of very dehumanizing things about Palestinians, like admit that they're animals, this kind of thing. And my mom had been on the board of Peace Now. She was a Middle Eastern Studies major. She, even though a staunch Zionist, she really like had embodied this sort of liberal Zionist ethos.
Yeah.
And so to hear her speak like that in conjunction with sort of watching, for example, or reading about Israelis kind of dragging the couch up to the highest hill to cheer as the bombs fell in Gaza, it sort of exemplified to me how far the discourse in the community had moved, and that some of these ideas of like, well, like we don't take any, like we have to do this and we don't take any pleasure in it. And this sort of like beleaguered occupier stance was sort of had really disintegrated, and that actually there was a real dehumanization going on. And I got very involved in If Not Now. At the time, I didn't know anyone in If Not Now. I showed up to like the first actions alone.
Let me just, for those who may not know, I mean, I think If Not Now was born at precisely that moment, right? I mean, it was
exactly that moment. Yeah, and in fact, there was no like organization at that time. It was really just like these actions that had sprung up. There were the people who organized them were organizers in different capacities, but If Not Now itself had no DNA, as they called it. They didn't really know what they were doing as a movement. So I actually like tried to get very involved at that moment, but they sort of like went back underground and tried to like build the organization before like bringing it back out and making it available for membership. But that year really changed a lot in my life, mostly because like I found that I really needed Jewish community to process like the kind of fracturing of my own Zionism, that it felt really important to do with Jews. Like I didn't feel like I could just do it alone. And honestly, that was sort of like the beginning of this chapter of my life.
It's just, I want to stop at that a little bit,
Sure.
Reflect on it a bit. I mean, sort of interesting story you're telling, because you have a very rich, thick Jewish background that includes a lot of Israel experiences, right? And then there's this period of sort of alienation or just distancing from the community, and then a reconnection around this event. So, but you call it, maybe you already were sort of speaking of it in hindsight as the fracturing of your Zionism. But what was actually happening there? There's kind of an overdetermined event, right? There's this kind of reconnection with Jewishness and a sort of a complete, or maybe not complete, but a somewhat kind of reevaluation of the Jewish education you had until then. How do all those pieces fit together?
I think like at the moment where this story is fracturing, it was so incredibly painful. I mean, like I was really like crying alone in my room every day, just reading the news. I think like the recognition of how painful it was also the recognition of how much it meant to me. You know, like it wasn't a question at that point of whether I was just going to like throw up my hands and kind of remove myself completely. I really felt extremely alone. Like I needed to figure out how to rebuild my identity and rebuild who I was in relationship to you know, a group of people that was doing the same thing. I mean, it was never a question for me that like, you know, like how was this going to challenge who I was as a Jew? You know, because for me, like Jewish identity has never actually been complicated. Like I'm not like, oh, am I a Jew? Am I a non-Jewish Jew? And this, like, you know, it's like I'm a Jew. That's what I am. So the question then was like, how do I be a Jew in this new way that I hadn't really, you know, been able to explore before.
Why did it lead to what you called like the fracturing of your Zionism? I mean, how did a war, admittedly, like an incredibly bloody, horrifying war, how did that war kind of retroactively undo political commitment?
You know, honestly, I honestly don't know. Like, because I really don't think that in this issue, you know, look, I think that at this point, I have all kinds of rationalizations for why that might have been the moment. You know, but truthfully, I think, and I've written about this before, I don't think that this is a rational issue. I think if it were actually everybody, I mean, I hate to say it like this, but if it were actually rational, you know, everyone can see the effects for themselves of what the occupation does to Palestinian people and also to Israelis and Israeli leftists, and you know, the way that it has sort of degraded democracy on you know, even within the Green Line. You know, but I honestly think that these kinds of processes and these kinds of truths are assimilated emotionally, and it's very different for every person. For me, I think it was very obvious that if there were so many lies, like the more that I, you know, read even in those first days, the more I realized just how much my education had hidden. And it just seemed to me that if you were comfortable in the narrative that you were telling, you wouldn't have to lie about it so completely. I mean, like so utterly. And not to mention,
I'm sorry, just go back on that a little bit also, because we don't have the same upbringing. Like I didn't have a day school education. I discovered today that I'm called a zero.
Who said that?
Well, I asked a question. You just heard that maybe like Jewish summer camps may be canceled for the summer, and so people are going through different stages of grief. And I never went to camp, just Jewish camp. I don't really get camp, and I didn't go to day school. And there's no youth group, and apparently Jews who didn't do any of those three things are called zero.
But who calls them that?
I don't know. That's some sort of sociological term, like, you know, in the kind of endless amount of ink that's spilled over Jewish identity in America.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's somewhat unusual for someone with that little Jewish, like, institutional background to then get so involved in Jewish life as I did. But I have noticed, right, that, and we talked about this. I want to get into this some more, right? That certainly your profile is more common than mine, certainly for those involved in something like If Not Now or Jewish Currents, very rich, thick Jewish backgrounds.
Yeah.
And
it's certainly true, like of our editorial staff, for instance. Like it would be very hard for someone who like wasn't raised with some of that institutional life to just like slot in a Jewish current. There'd be too much catching up to do, which is not to say that the work itself is not accessible, but it is to say that like you'd have to acculturate yourself to a whole body of knowledge that it would take a lot of time to build up, I think, if you hadn't remedied that in some way, like if you hadn't as an adult become very involved or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still doing catch up. Right. So, but part of the upshot of that, though, is that my Zionism, such as it is not the product of anybody teaching me about Zionism at any point. I mean, other than my own, I think the first book I ever got my hands on about Israel was Chomsky's The Fateful Triangle, which was like just around when I was an undergrad. You know, and then like Arthur Hertzberg's book on Zionism, which is fantastic, his reader, things like that. So but that experience you're talking about being lied to, I mean, you said, if you were so confident in your narrative, you wouldn't need to lie about it.
Well, I mean, and look, I also think that like my entire worldview is not consistent with Israel. Like, it wasn't like I was like super patriotic about America. It wasn't
Right.
like I felt like, oh, like the nation state, this is like a really positive thing for the world. Like, military dominance, like, yes, like I want that. I want like a place that is like guided by like a military life cycle, and like a military way of life, as a nation state. And by the way, everything they do is perfect. It just suddenly I was like, oh my God, like not only is this just like a nation state, like all the other nation states with, but it's also one that's been carrying on, an almost 50-year occupation, military occupation. Like what is involved in that? Like what goes
So
into
it's really like the scales fell from your eyes in a certain way. Like you were given a picture that just did not match up with what you were then reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. I mean,
And reading like in the New York Times, like those pieces were by like Jody Rudorin. Like they weren't even that like, I mean, Jody Rudorin is a Zionist, like.
Right. The pieces about the war in Gaza, you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And presumably then you went back and you looked, you started to read more broadly and so on.
Exactly. Yeah.
So 2014 was a really fateful time. You got involved in If Not Now. And then there's about 4 years, I think, between that and the relaunching of Jewish Currents.
Yeah, I think, I guess, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 4 years.
So just tell us, like, how did you alluded, I want to get into this much later. You already kind of told us that you were a writer and that you're in writing, but how did you find your way for sort of being on the periphery to some degree of If Not Now into, right, Jewish Currents and then ultimately helming Jewish Currents?
I got really very involved in If Not Now, which was sort of weird because I had no organizing experience. I wasn't an organizer. And also I was like, on the whole, much older than like your average If Not Now Nick, if you will. And I didn't know anyone because I just didn't, there was like, in the beginning, at least, it felt like particularly like everybody in that world was from a certain world, like Habanim Dror, or, something like that. But I got really involved again, out of a deep need, out of like real necessity, spiritual necessity. And I had really wanted, I mean, from the beginning, I had wanted to kind of hold a space in the organization for cultural work, for basically like arts stuff. And, there were some small successes, but I'd say on the whole, and also like, I really enjoyed learning to organize and like being in this movement. But I would say on the whole, like in terms of doing art and cultural work, I was pretty frustrated. And If Not Now, because I just don't think that, that these kinds of political organizations, at least the way that If Not Now is structured, are actually like the best place for art creation. I mean, like, I think like for the most part, you're engaged in the production of agitprop or propaganda or whatever. I mean, for If Not Now, I thought it was like potentially, kind of a real missed opportunity, because I thought that the work that they were trying to do, which is basically like change hearts and minds in the Jewish community around the occupation, was actually cultural work. And that in order to like truly do cultural work, you need to make, to like have cultural production, like in the arts sphere. But it just became very hard to square that with kind of like a kind of more democratic organizing structure, which is something that I've written a lot about at Jewish Currents. And so kind of at the moment that I was feeling sort of frustrated with all that, even though like, again, it wasn't like If Not Now's fault, I think it's just sort of a mismatch. But at the moment that I was feeling, kind of frustrated with like what I was actually able to give to the movement, Jewish Currents relaunched. And at the time I had just published a essay in Guernica about failing to publish my novel, which like during those years that I was organizing with If Not Now was sort of like, I was finishing my novel and then trying to get it published. And, like this organizing was almost like a a thing that I did with a lot of my time, because I was sort of waiting to hear from agents and, whatever. And Jacob Plittman, who had been hired at that point to kind of bring Jewish currents to the next generation, basically got in touch with me about an essay that I had written about failing to publish my book. And we met in a cafe. We didn't really know each other. And at the time, I had also, because of my frustration with, if not now, I had been working on sort of like a sort of insane white paper about how, like, we need, the Jews need a kind of more secular, progressive institution that's going to do events and publications and kind of be like almost like a cultural institutional home. And I was like, I'm going to raise like $5 million for this. I'm going to do this, which is not something I had ever thought, not something I had ever, like, I've never raised money for anything. This is totally outside of the realm. But I was just like, we need to do this. This is kind of like the next step from, if not now, for me. And Jacob was sort of like, this is Jewish currents. You should just come on board. And, I had also, because of my writing background, had been doing editing. I'd been kind of freelance editing fiction books for friends. And then more than, friends of friends, kind of like it had started to take off in a word of mouth sense. So the rest is history, basically.
Yeah, so then, right. So, I mean, I have to say that I'm personally profoundly jealous of Jewish currents, because like I also have a dream of a Jewish cultural center, but in those 2 years, really, since the relaunching of Jewish currents, it just exploded, right? I mean, it's really been hugely successful. I'm sure a lot of that is due to your talents. And it also must be that you've really hit a nerve, right? That
Oh yeah. I mean, I think look, I think it's really both. Like, I think, first of all, we came with a vision. We knew that we wanted something very intellectually rigorous, but also accessible. We came with a very serious ethos and a like very serious and deep approach to the subject matter, which is sort of like both Jewish life and Jewish cultural production and like left politics, and then the intersection of both. But also, like, I mean, as Jacob said to the previous editor, Larry Bush, and the previous editorial board, sorry, it's got very loud outside my window. I hope it's not too loud. But as Jacob had said to them, they were looking for the next generation to give the magazine to. They knew that if it was going to survive, and it's been in print 76 years, they knew that if it was going to survive, it had to get to the next generation, but they didn't know any millennials. And Jacob really, like, I think part of what he sold to them when he got the job initially was basically saying, look, I know the people who need this. I know that there's a need, and I think it was so clear from the first party. I mean, we had like 400, 500 people right away packed into the space, totally ecstatic, like impromptu horror, just like nothing any of us had ever seen, and like a very different scene than like your average, if not now, protest or whatever, because there was also media people there and artists there, and just like a kind of more diverse scene, people from the DSA, like a sort of a scene of people who might not necessarily go to like a Jewish political event. And I think that that's actually what I was always hankering for, and if not now, was sort of a space that wasn't tied to some kind of teleological political straight line goal, but actually like a kind of third, outside space to kind of process all of it.
Yeah. So if it's okay, I mean, so Jacob wrote, I think it was in the first issue.
The first issue that
this kind of, this really extraordinary mission statement. Obviously it's not your writing, it's his writing. So I'm not going to assume that you agree with everything he wrote, but a lot of it.
No, but it's fair to say that it's sort of like a vision statement for the magazine.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. It really should be, I think, like anthologized, if you know.
Called on an emerging diasporism.
That's right, on emerging diasporism. And I just went back to reread it. And so there he talks about what he calls the diasporic double bind, that frames the thinking of like this cohort that you're speaking about, that you emerge from, and that you kind of in many ways, I think, have, galvanized. And so he says, what's that double bind? He says, like, we're pinched between late capitalist America and an Israel that proved to be more state than Messiah. I mean, he goes on, but I wonder, that's a really interesting, that, first of all, there's a lot of interesting assumptions sort of buried in that, but also that it really speaks to a moment. So let's speak, I think the horrors of late capitalist America, let's say, you've written about, I say, particularly beautifully during this crisis, during the COVID-19 crisis. I think I want to recommend that people go back and read your first dispatch from quarantine. No one is well.
No one is well, yeah.
No one is well, which is really about reflecting on that. But let's talk just for a second. I know we've already touched on it.
I mean, look, I think on a certain level, I think part of the reason that we're seeing the kind of excitement for Jewish currents that we're seeing is because on some level, I think a lot of people, first of all, who, were generally progressive are, post-Trump, and who are Jewish, are post-Trump kind of feeling their Jewishness in a new way. So, with the rise of, with Charlottesville, with the rise of white nationalism, I think like the idea that sort of like, well, I'm Jewish, but it's not really a thing, is suddenly like, doesn't feel viable in the same way that it did. And there's definitely both a desire to kind of disassimilate, but also like a process that is like sort of a little bit outside of choice in that moment, because there's just a felt difference. What
you've written about is sort of Jews not, whatever whiteness has given us is all of a sudden feeling like it's not really ours anymore to claim.
It's certainly ours, but like it's in question and in play in a different kind of way. And I also just think like at the same time, many of us, like the promise of whiteness and the thing that Jews really were able to take advantage of is this certain kind of class uplift, like that was sort of what assimilation was about. And now we're all downwardly mobile. I mean, most of us are pretty much downwardly mobile. There is, especially with the situation with COVID, like there really is, that promise has been revoked. That contract has been revoked. Like a lot of us don't have health insurance, or work service jobs that no longer exist, or, and I think part of the expectation there is like, okay, well, even if this America thing doesn't pan out, we can always just run to Israel. And I think the fact that Israel has become in some ways, a worse deal than the United States on some level. I mean, not like, of course, if we went there, we would be highly privileged members, the most privileged members of that society. At the same time, to know what that state is doing doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like an option anymore, especially like if we're fleeing Trump to go to run into Bibi's arms, it just doesn't seem correct. And so, the proposal from Jacob's piece is Doikite, a kind of recommitment to diasporism, a recommitment to here-ness, which sort of stops imagining that our lives actually exist over there and starting to like reinvest in our communities and in our communities in collaboration and conversation with other communities and other oppressed communities. I think that's basically it.
But so he raises a question in that piece, which is interesting also. I mean, so this question of he says, right, Israel is proved to be more state than Messiah, which I think echoes what you were saying about the way in which you were really educated to think of Israel, which is not just a state, but something that has greater significance than that. And in the piece, he quotes the Reformed theologian Eugene Borowitz. I don't have it in front of me right now, but he says something like, look, if Israel were to turn out to be just merely a state, not a particularly bad state, but just merely a state, that itself would be such a disappointment to, I guess, whoever his readership is. And there is, I think, for me, a question that I have, right, of the analysis of Israel. Is Israel merely a state in a time when that itself is kind of beneath some acceptable floor? That is,
I mean, I just don't think there's quite another example. I mean, look, like there are older examples, like from before there was sort of a broad colonial analysis, like in like Western thought or whatever. You know, like obviously there's what, you know, happened in the United States to the Native Americans. There have been other, you know, colonial projects that have done horrible things. I can't think of anything that's happening in this time, knowing what we know in full view. And that has been going on quite so long at this point. I don't think that it's just like, and also enjoying kind of like the privileges of like a developed state that's sort of like welcomed into, so, you know, that's given this much money in aid, for example, or that's sort of, you know, like I think like on some level we can say, well, Israel's, you know, like why don't, you know, like there's always this constant whataboutism. Why aren't we boycotting Congo or something, you know?
Well, I don't want to get into the whataboutism thing. To me, it's more in your analysis, right? Is it that Borowitz has been proven right in the sense that it has revealed itself to be merely a state, or is it some? For example, it was presented to you not merely as a state, but as some sort of like the thing that rises above states.
For sure.
Now, is it been, when the scales fell from your eyes, right? Is it merely a state, or is it something worse than that? Is it a particularly, you know?
I mean, it's not. It is a bad example of how badly these things can go. You know, it's not like merely a run of the, you know, I mean, like all states do criminal things, and you know, Israel has been doing some really criminal things for a really long time. You know, and I also just think again, like it's like sort of out of sync with like when a lot of these colonial projects happened, you know. I mean, although like not entirely, but you know, on some level.
Right. I think that really is maybe part of the nub of our disagreement. To me, it's like a mediocre state. Like it's done some pretty terrible things. It has had some real successes to its name. Much of it, I mean, certainly the terrible things it does, I'm no interest in defending, and I have no interest in sort of building it up to be some sort of light unto the nations either. Feels like just a more, and I agree with you. I mean, not that it's a normal state. There's many things.
I mean, like I just can't think of any other 50-year military occupation that is like being carried out currently with like this measure of brutality. There are other forms.
I mean, there is what China is doing in its west and has been.
Yeah. I mean, there are other.
I don't want to get into that whataboutism.
Forms, but I'm just saying, like, it's pretty bad, and like it's doing so like with, you know, billions of dollars in aid from Americans, and with the full moral support of our Jewish institutions, and like large swaths of the Jewish community who literally are just not dealing with it on any level. So I do think that that's sort of different too, you know, like I don't think that like other criminal actor states or whatever, whoever they are, just like have this kind of devoted cadre in the most powerful country in the world, well, at least for the time being, you know, who have basically made it impossible to criticize it. I mean, that is also unique to Israel.
I'm not, just for this, so we don't get to send this. I know that people will want me at this point to argue with you. I'm not going to.
Okay.
we differ on the way you've characterized those things. I'm interested in the way in which you see it right there. And I think that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, I'm like a little asterisk, like I differ, but that doesn't matter right now. So
I mean, look, I also think that like there is something quite interesting in the way that, you know, in sort of the psychology behind like the way that this has all played out, you know, like you have this country that is now extremely powerful with a deep feeling of victimhood and vulnerability. And I think that also creates a really dangerous situation because they'll never feel safe enough. There's no way to feel safe enough. It will never happen. Yeah. And it justifies anything. I mean, like, you know, anything that, I mean, as far as this can go, it may go. And the justification for that will be Jewish suffering previously. And so, I think also that, I don't think that's quite unique. Like, I think like all groups feel themselves to have been, like, and also plenty of groups that are now in the role of oppressor have a narrative about themselves in which they were previously oppressed. But I do think it's particularly acute in Jewish context.
One of the defining sort of like styles, I think, of many people in the orbit that I know that are in your orbit is sort of laughing disdain at the idea of liberal Zionism, right? Like I've noticed that itself has become a sort of like a punchline to some degree. And so I just wonder, like there's a book that I read that is deeply uncool to both have read and to have been impressed by, which is Yossi Klein Halevi's recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. You maybe read it.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it, unfortunately.
I mean, the basic approach that he takes there is that part of the tragedy of the situation is that there's a claim of right against right, that we have competing narratives, competing claims to the whole of the land, and that within a certain Zionist Jewish narrative, which is quite widespread, though you may dissent from it, there's a claim to the whole of the land, and within the Palestinian national narrative, there's a claim to the whole of the land, and that the tragedy is that both can't both be realized in the real world, that there has to be some sort of a give on one side or the other.
Well, first of all, I actually think both can be realized in the real world because I think, well, first of all, I think confederation is a really, really good option, and that confederation actually creates some measure of that to come to fruition. But also, like, I don't know. I mean, what's the question? Like, there's no resolution to this?
No. The question I was leading to is, I remember that, like, If Not Now. Again, you don't speak for If Not Now, so I don't mean to conflate you, but I'm just doing my best to put out a sort of like a supplemental reading list, right? That they propose that, like, Camp Ramah, all the places that indoctrinated you so poorly, right? Or I mean, so well, and then also ultimately so poorly, that they teach more. But what part of my worry, I think, a little bit, right, in this kind of emerging narrative, is not that there is sort of a tragic claim of right against right, with one party clearly having the upper hand over the other and oppressing the other, but instead is sort of a rejection of the whole, what Yossi would call like the Jewish narrative, right? I mean, that narrative is not our narrative. And so it's sort of like a disclaiming of any claim whatsoever. This is entirely not ours.
Like that narrative is not my narrative. Like, my family did not go to Israel. Like, like my grandparents could have left Athens and Salonika for Israel, and my grandmother's only surviving sister did, but they didn't. They came to Brooklyn, and actually, like, my grandfather didn't stay, like, they didn't stay in Palestine. They left before it became a state, so like they made a decision. Like, those were real decisions that they made, so like, to what extent is that
Palestinians live in Palestine either, right? I mean, that doesn't invalidate the legitimacy.
No, but what I'm saying is like, in what way is that narrative my narrative? Like, my narrative is actually a narrative of diasporism. So like, the idea that like we share this narrative, like, why? Like, I can build a narrative in any way that I see fit. Like, what is if I see a greater truth in pieces of their narrative, like, what is the idea that I'm giving up on our narrative? Like, what is this them and us? Like, the only kind of narrative that gets us out of this is a hybrid narrative. So like, what is the point actually of basically saying, like, why would you give up what our narrative is? I mean, also, like, just to say, like, you're talking about the disdain for liberal Zionists. Like, I'm looking at my mother, like, our narrative ends up for her in admit that they're animals, which is what it ended up with for a lot of, like, for large swaths of like liberal Zionism on some level, which is a real dehumanization over time, especially after the second Intifada and the buses and all that stuff. So again, like, I don't think it's like I don't think it's like laughing at liberal Zionists for the sake of, just snark or something. I think there's a real question, which is basically like, liberal Zionists really have major questions to answer in this moment, especially with annexation looming. Like the thing that they've been, the whole worldview that they've been pushing and what they've been allowing to happen in the meantime, which is what a lot of the left was saying, like, look, while you're talking about two states and coexistence, look what's happening, look at the reality of what's happening. And now we're there, like we're kind of at the doorstep of all of those things that the left said was going to happen. And the narrative on the part of liberal Zionists is not changing. And so it's not just, and meanwhile, also like liberal Zionists are sort of like in power in the Jewish American establishment, and yet have like zero desire to use any leverage on, in any way against kind of our Israeli counterparts.
I agree with all that you're saying. And I also agree with you about the soul searching. I mean, that is to say, like, in a certain sense, the claims that annexation has already happened de facto are powerful claims.
Yeah.
I'm not so persuaded that a formal statement of annexation makes that much of a difference.
Sure.
Or another.
Whether you think it already happened or whether you think it matters that it's going to happen, we know there is a separate and unequal system and a very brutal system of segregation and humiliation and incarceration. And I mean, like, let's, we could go.
I mean, I guess to me, what liberal Zionism has come to mean for me is this sort of unhappiness with Zionism, in the sense that what I mean is I have a whole host of political commitments that I don't see the state of Israel fulfilling. And yet, I cannot sort of shed this notion that the Jewish national rebirth in the land of Israel and all that goes along with it, for the growth of numbers from a tiny minority to soon to be the majority of Jews living there. And, we talked just before we started taping, like popular music in Israel and all of the kind of cultural ferment and leftist activists agitating, all of this stuff to me seems not just sort of like a, well, that's good, like a nice little gift bag I get in my disappointment for Israel moving into a totally anti-liberal direction, but so significant in the life of the Jewish people as a collective historically, that the idea that we would sort of consciously sever ourselves from those elements with a doikite, like using Jacob's idea, cut off our Jewish life from all of that because of the illiberal direction of the state and the oppression and the violence and so on. That's the piece that deeply.
But look, I don't think that this, first of all, I don't think that like anyone is arguing that, like, I mean, I personally, as someone who doesn't identify as a Zionist, don't feel that like that means an invalidation of Israeli culture and Israeli life. Like there is Israeli life in Israel, and it should continue, and it should be, vibrant and beautiful, inshallah. But like,
that was so Israeli of you to say, by the way.
but I don't think that necessarily is the same. And also, like, again, like personal relationships, like, my family's there. I have plenty of friends, like, I'm not like advocating that I cut them off for some political ideal, but I do think that institutionally and systemically, we have to do a real breakup, because we have long ago stopped investing in our own Jewish communities. And the results of that have been devastating on a cultural level, on an educational level. I mean, there have been 30 years of disinvestment in the Jewish community in the United States and in other diasporas for the purposes of Israel, for the purposes of feeling close to Israel, for the purposes of basically helping us feel like the only way that we can access a Jewishness in ourselves is to be over there. And most of us are never really going to live there. So like, what does that say about what does it say about our capacity to be Jews where we are? It basically just invalidates them. It gives us no other option, which is why so many Jews are disaffected, honestly, which is why, like, there's all this question, I mean, this is like the question, the sociologist question, the hand wringing, where are all the young people? And Jewish Currents has one party and 500 ecstatic kids show up. It's like, if you just give people a different way to express that identity, they will show up. They want it. They desperately want it,
So great. So, I mean, so one thing that this is a nice segue here is that Jacob says in that piece is that rage is what fires so much of the energy. He's talking about 2017, 2018, so much the energy here, but that rage, a sense of betrayal, by Jewish institutions, but that sense of rage and betrayal will inevitably dissipate. You can't be surprised and betrayed forever, and something has to replace it, right?
Absolutely.
Something, right? So let's talk about a bit of sort of what you're trying to do.
I had Jacob on, but I'm just saying.
I'm sorry to be quoting him to you. Also want to, I wanted, this was also a segue to, in my outline, to get to your Guernica piece about that Jacob had read, which I went back and read, and is a magnificent piece. It really is an amazing piece about your struggles to write this novel. You spent many years writing it, and then ultimately couldn't get it published. And right, you're willing to consider that maybe the novel just didn't enrapture people the way it was meant to. But the responses that you got didn't suggest that. It suggested that, in fact, there was a resistance to something distinctly and kind of literately Jewish in the popular culture. So can you just talk a little bit about, I know that your work in culture is trying to build that, but how are you hoping to move American Jewish culture?
I just, in some ways, don't feel like we've had a very robust and deep Jewish literary tradition in the past however many decades. You think about kind of like the giants of Jewish literature, like Grace Paley and Cynthia Ozick and Philip Roth and Saul Bellow, and you could go on. And that really like meant something. Like they were really coded Jewish in this particular way. They all resisted it in their own way and embraced it in their own way. But I think you could argue that basically there was something that people felt was authentically Jewish about them. And I think what people mean when they say things like that is really just that like being Jewish meant something different at that point in time. Whereas now being Jewish means sort of like being white or whatever, for white Jews, or just being kind of assimilated into a certain kind of, experience in the United States. And for many of us, that's sort of like an East Coast, whatever, like educated, upper middle class kind of thing. And so a lot of the ways that sort of Jewish literature has proceeded is sort of in a very, I sometimes refer to it as like, it's like seasoning or something. You throw like a Yiddish word in italics in, or, like they celebrate a holiday here and there, but it's like kind of hard to put your finger on what is like deeply Jewish about it. And I think we actually talked about Joshua Cohen. I think Joshua Cohen is a real exception to that, and also like speaks to like some of the issues that people have had with his work and like how accessible it is, how sort of like popular it is. It's certainly not like other people that you brought up, like Jonathan Safran Foer or Nicole Kraus or something.
I heard Joshua Cohen in conversation with Alana Newhouse. Said something really interesting there, which was really fascinating to me. She kind of took him, she said, you present Jews, we were talking about Moving Kings, which I think was his most recent novel, and how unflattering some of the portraits. There it's both about Israeli occupation and also about kind of Jewish moving magnates in Long Island and city, and how unflattering these portraits are, and how it kind of gives, I think you would say, like in a traditional register, like gives pitchon peh, like it gives ammunition to anti-Semites. And he said, once Jews started writing in English, they stopped writing for other Jews. And all of a sudden, there was a sort of a code of silence that you wouldn't do something, you wouldn't be so truthful that it would be a shanda for the goyim. And so, which is such an interesting idea, right? And so like to be really truthful as a novelist in the way that like the early Roth was about how terrible his Jewish upbringing was.
Have you seen, oh my God, I can't believe I'm blanking because I really love this play. This is because it's 9:30 p.m.
I have little children, so I haven't been to a new play in a long time.
Oh my gosh. It's the play about Shalom Ash and the God of Vengeance.
Yeah, I forget what it's called and I haven't seen it and I wish I had seen it.
It's so great. I really loved it. Gosh, I'm sorry. I just have
to look it up. Yeah, no, it sounded amazing.
Indecent. Sorry. Oh my God.
Right.
That was going to kill me. Sorry. But yeah, that play is sort of about how like, Shalom Ash wrote this play about like a Jewish whorehouse owner and you know, it was such a shanda for the goyim, and like actually like the Jews were the ones who called the cops on the play for indecency, basically,
Right.
you know, and got it initially shut down. I mean, which is so, I mean, it's so obvious. It's like the kind of thing that's happening all the time, you know. I mean, we just had a situation this week where, for example, de Blasio did this stupid tweet about, you know, Jews, please, you know, Jews, the time has come for you to listen up or whatever.
Yeah, to the Jewish community and all communities.
Yeah. Which was a very stupid tweet. But at the same time, like, you know, the piece that we wrote about it that we thought was very important to introduce into the conversation was basically about the city politics angle, about the fact that de Blasio and these communities have a really close relationship, and actually that he's been kind of trading votes for autonomy for a very long time. And this is sort of a reflection of the limits of that strategy, because obviously in a public health emergency, there is no autonomy. And in fact, how like all of the kind of non-Haredi communities were like rushing to dump on de Blasio, but the Haredi communities were apologizing and defending him and, you know, whatever. But of course, like, you know, the piece included a lengthy history of basically the relationship between de Blasio and these groups, including like him kind of engaging in sort of political horse trading so that they don't have to actually teach secular studies in their schools, even though they were really supposed to do that. And also stuff about Metzitza Bapeh, where, you know, there were children dying of herpes because they would do the suction on the wound of a circumcision, and the moil who would, you know, transfer whatever he had to the baby.
Yeah.
De Blasio let that happen, and then some babies got very sick or died, you know. And like immediately this piece got picked up by this podcast Red Scare, which, you know, are kind of like edgelordy, you know, dirtbag left kind of figures or whatever, but like we're also kind of invoking it in this very like anti-Hasidish way. And so like, you know, of course it makes us uncomfortable. And at the same time, what are you going to do? You have to print the truth, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Although I guess, you know, Cohen was saying in a certain sense, what makes that, I mean, as soon as Jews started writing in German, let's say, right, you have the emergence of like liberal Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, my analysis these days is that this whole idea that Jews are a sort of have a moral mission that's distinct, and that therefore we are at a higher moral plane, emerges from that, not from the traditional sources, but from German Jews wanting to defend the Jewish honor.
Well, they were always pretty stuck up, you know.
There's that. But I do worry that like American Jews have imbibed this idea that Jews have some particularly proud history of being morally on the right side of history. Which,
yeah, you know, and that also plays out in the Israel politics. I mean, that's right. Like, yeah.
No, we're not. We're just schmucks like anybody. And like, you know, right. So, but I guess but so how do we then like revitalize Jewish culture in America in a real way? Both, there's kind of there's a double piece. I mean, first, there's getting funders and the kind of establishment, whoever is holding the purse strings, to take it seriously on the one hand.
Yeah.
Also resurrecting, as you said, like a real lived sense of Jewishness having something distinct to offer in a literary and cultural mode on the part of the cultural producers. Like, how do we do that?
Well, first of all, I think what you just said, like, I think we need to reinvest. So like, I think we need to bring back, you know, programs that help artists engage with text, with different kind of ideas, you know, traditional text. And well, first of all, let me just say, like, I think that textual study is enormously important, if not in a religious sense, but even in a secular sense. I kind of don't know what we do or how we re-engage with Judaism without re-engaging with Jewish texts. I just don't know what it means otherwise. And I also don't know why we would cede that only to Orthodox people. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And I also think that means we also engage with like the full spectrum of Jewish thought and Jewish letters. So that, you know, that means like not just going back to Jewish texts, but also like studying history through this kind of lens, and like looking at the way that different thinkers across time were engaging with one another, and engaging with different kinds of Jewish philosophical concepts. It really is a process of becoming literate again as Jews. And I think that's a really tall order, because our institutions have really failed us and made it like impossible for us to do that. I mean, first of all, because they have made it so incredibly political, and particularly around Israel. And so like, you know, that narrative necessitates stamping out so much of Jewish history, so much of Jewish thought, because so much of it becomes threatening, frankly,
Right.
you know. But then also it's just like they have created a self-reinforcing, you know, a vicious cycle where people don't feel like they want this kind of engagement because they have never had it and they've never seen it done well, you know.
Yeah. I mean, literally, these are words out of my heart. I agree with you entirely. I mean, the other element is to engage with traditional text, you need to have language. You know, you need to have Hebrew, and you need to have Aramaic in particular.
It's tough.
It's tough. It's a tall order. But I totally agree with you. I think without Jewish language, you're always going through this scrim that's just, it's not your own. You know, you're always at the mercy of a translator. Yeah.
You know, Robert Alter, I think, has done a very valiant job. And I think like if people wanted to start there, I think that would be great too. Like, I think there are ways to do it, you know?
Always. I mean, I was always hoping, I guess part of what happened to me is I had the idea for me, because Israel was so important with language, that Israeli popular culture is such a way in, because then there's these depths to the language. At just the moment when appetite for Israel particularly bottomed out around.
But that's only one way in. And frankly, like, you know, I mean, Israeli culture, like the idea that Israeli culture is particularly Jewish is like not, I mean, I don't think of Israeli culture as particularly Jewish. And in fact, like, I think most Israelis don't think about Israeli culture as particularly Jewish. They think about it as Israeli, you know, like I've never met more secular people than most Israelis who are not religious, you know.
Yeah. No, I agree.
And so the conflation of Jewish culture, I mean, as I told you when we last spoke, I mean, you know, there are plenty of people that I'm friends with in Israel who are trying to think through what it would mean for them to like have kind of a conception of themselves as also being diasporic, and also having a diasporic Jewish culture within Israel. Because there's a real, like, I think that a lot of my friends who are looking for something Jewish in their lives in Israel are feeling totally ill-equipped to access it, like completely.
I mean, it's to the extent that this is something we can participate in together, it's the most exciting and the most urgent thing. I also, in the piece in Guernica, you know, you debate whether or not you yourself will continue writing after the kind of horrible heartbreak of working so long to not see it published. And at the end, you have this beautiful reflection that in certain sense, religious language is the only language you have for the discipline and the practice, spiritual practice of writing, of continuing to write. And to see those two things as, you know, really one, sort of the kind of the Jewish urge to continually engage with God and seek God, and also seek truth in writing. So I look forward to you becoming our new Cynthia Ozek, you know, to really, I think.
No, I just don't think it's going to happen at this point, because I just feel like my practice has just moved to editing so completely, and that's just what I spend all my time doing. And it's just hard to imagine having the kind of life that would allow me to write like that. I mean, I found like some kind of weird sweet spot in terms of like having this job that I only worked 3 days a week, that I was able to somehow spend the rest of the week writing and all of that kind of thing. And I feel like it's all over now. I'm on like this editorial track, and it's hard to imagine getting off of it, basically. But maybe one day.
I'm sure that's wrong. I think the time is running down. I want to also register dissents that we will hold back for future conversation. I'm not sure all the blame lies with disinvestment. I think some of the blame lies with the people themselves. And so we need to find a way to.
But I just think that there's no way to disentangle that loop or whatever, you know? I mean, like, do people believe these things and want these things because they naturally want them? And then the funding was sort of just a response to that. Like, I kind of feel like that isn't really borne out in like the history and the literature. I mean, basically, like, there were all these sociologists who, had a different thing every year that they were worried about, and the big money followed their recommendations, and then things happened that had like tangible effects on Jewish life,
Yeah.
like birthright, like, I mean, you name it. So, I mean, I obviously, like, some of the blame lies with people, and like, I think like we have a community now that in some ways, like, the people who are involved very much like reflect the will of those funders, but also there's just so many people who are just not involved because they don't see themselves reflected. So in some sense it succeeded, and in some senses it failed, very, very seriously.
Thank you for this conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Wish you continued success.
Yeah, you too.
And please make sure, to all the people out there, make sure to read the pieces we reference. We'll make sure to put them in the footnotes, and keep up with. It gets published daily. Is that right, on the internet?
Yeah. Every weekday we publish work, so like 4 to 5 times a week, and then the magazine is quarterly.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Ariel.
Thanks. Bye bye. Oh wait.
Oh yes.
Can I just like plug
Yes.
Jewish Currents?
Plug it, man.
Yeah. Okay. So Jewish Currents is the longest running English language magazine of the Jewish left. It's 76 years old. You can subscribe at jewishcurrents.org. It's only $30 for a year, $50 for 2 years. And, or you could just read us online, but it's better to support us.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.